We're digging into Isaiah today. As promised on Monday, we looked at the history of the southern kingdom, the succession of kings from Rehoboam down through the Babylonian exile, and then told you that we would start looking at the prophets of the southern kingdom. We've already looked at the prophets that are most closely associated with the northern kingdom and delivered their message to the northern kingdom. And so now we're going to start doing the same for the southern kingdom, now that we've seen the history of the southern kingdom. And one of the things to note pretty quickly with this is that, one, there are several more of them. There are more prophets associated with the southern kingdom than the northern kingdom, and that some of those prophets are quite a bit longer than the other prophets, the prophets associated with the southern kingdom. In fact, there's a group of prophets called the major prophets, and as distinct from the minor prophets. And does anybody know or want to guess what the difference between the major prophets and the minor prophets is?
How many stories there are about them?
Close. How long they are. Just how long is the book? That's it. There's no great deep mystery. It's just how long is it? Yeah. So there are 3 or 4 prophets that are usually described as being major prophets. You've got Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and sometimes Daniel. Daniel is quite a bit shorter, and by length it's more into the minor prophet category. And it's just referred to so often that some people start thinking of it as a major prophet. But there are these major prophets, and they are significantly longer than the minor prophets, which make up most of the prophets of the Old Testament. But 2 of the 3 major prophets, or 2 of the 4 major prophets, depending on whether you count Daniel or not, are prophets associated with the southern kingdom. And so we have Isaiah and Jeremiah that are both prophets of the southern kingdom and are also major prophets. And Isaiah, in fact, is one of the longest books of the Old Testament. I mean, the book of Psalms is pretty much always going to win this contest because it's got 150 chapters, or 150 distinct psalms. But Isaiah is on up there because it's got 66 chapters, 66 sections or chapters for Isaiah. And so it's very long, and that reflects actually on Isaiah's extremely long tenure as a prophet. As we said, the written prophets are generally going to be the compiled records or the compiled writings of the prophets as they are delivering messages to God's people, whoever God has directed them to go to. And so the prophet Isaiah, having 66 chapters, he had a long ministry. In fact, we know from just internally in the book, we know that Isaiah worked at least from the time of the end of the reign of Uzziah the king, which was right around the turn of the century, the 700s BC, or 739 BC, my bad, up until the fall of the northern kingdom and the siege of Jerusalem by Assyria that was defeated. And we know that happened around 701 BC. So there's at least 40 years in there where Isaiah is active, where Isaiah is working. And it's very possible that he kept working for a while after the failed siege of Jerusalem by Assyria. We just don't know for sure because, in fact, we do know that he went for a little longer after that. We don't know how long because there's just no internal evidence in Isaiah for how long he was prophesying after that. But Isaiah had a very long career, and we have a lot of material from Isaiah. It's also worth noting that Isaiah is the most frequently quoted prophet by the New Testament authors. The authors of the New Testament refer back to Isaiah more often than any other Old Testament prophet, and that's largely because the content of Isaiah and the message that he was given seems to look forward a lot to the coming king in the line of David, the Messiah, and there are a lot of details in Isaiah that seem to be fulfilled by Jesus in the New Testament. And so the New Testament authors are very frequently pointing back to Isaiah to show how Jesus did something that fulfills these words of Isaiah. Isaiah is introduced to us as being the son of Amoz, Isaiah the son of Amoz, A-M-O-Z, and that he is prophesying during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. And so we have this succession of kings that Isaiah is prophesying during all of them. As I mentioned, there's about a 40-year period. We know for sure that Isaiah is active, from the death of Uzziah through at least the reign of Hezekiah. There's going to be several things that we see in Isaiah, several themes that we see picked up in Isaiah that are very important to note at the beginning. Otherwise, you will kind of get lost in the rest of Isaiah. Again, 66 chapters, it's a lot of material. If you don't orient yourself around these major themes, you may get lost. But then also, these themes in Isaiah and a lot of the language of Isaiah is going to be picked up by not only the New Testament authors, but some of the other prophets, some of the other minor prophets in the Old Testament. And so, for example, Nahum uses a lot of Isaiah's language as Isaiah describes the fall of Babylon, as we'll get to a little later. When Isaiah gets to describing the judgment on and the fall of Babylon, Nahum will take a lot of that language and use it to describe the fall of Assyria, which happens earlier. And so Nahum is doing something interesting there that hopefully we will have time to get to Nahum, but if we don't, my point here is that Nahum uses Isaiah and some of the other prophets do as well. And so these themes are very important to pick up for understanding the book of Isaiah, for understanding the New Testament when you get there, and for understanding some of the interconnections between the various Old Testament prophets. So picking up these themes is important. We have two major divisions, major sections that divide up Isaiah. First, we have chapters 1 through 39, which recounts a whole lot of Isaiah's prophecies regarding Jerusalem and Judea and the nations surrounding them and Babylon, and what God is going to do through all of them and to all of them, and how God is going to judge them because of various failures. So all of that is a whole lot of judgment in chapters 1 through 39. And then there is a pretty sharp break, and then chapters 40 through 66 will have a very different tone. And as we get to the second section, we'll talk about why that probably is. Actually, the chapters 1 through 35 are prophecies of Isaiah, the recorded messages of Isaiah, and a few things that happened to Isaiah, narratives. But then chapters 36 through 39 are actually almost directly copy and paste from the books of 2 Kings and 2 Chronicles, relating some of the things that happened during Hezekiah's kingdom, and bring a pretty sharp end to that section at about the point where the Babylonian Empire comes on the scene. So again, we'll get there when we get there. In chapters 1 through 12 of Isaiah, we get a series of prophecies and experiences that introduce us to the major themes that are going to be repeated quite often throughout the book. And to some major things that some of us may recognize from New Testament or being in and around church for any amount of time. The first thing we see is the first several chapters introduce us with several prophecies against Judah and the city of Jerusalem. And what's interesting or very significant about these prophecies against Jerusalem and Judea is the contrast that Isaiah draws and the attention that Isaiah draws to the failures of Jerusalem and how far it is falling short of what it ought to be as the city of God's people, how much corruption and evil is done there, how much oppression happens among God's people, this group that's supposed to be God's people. And then he draws this contrast between what Jerusalem is in Isaiah's day and what God wants Jerusalem to be, and what God promises to make Jerusalem be sometime in the future. And so there is this contrast between Jerusalem as it is and what Isaiah refers to and what gets picked up and used elsewhere as the New Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that God will rescue, the Jerusalem that God will restore and redeem and make what God intends for Jerusalem to be. And so there's this promise or series of descriptions of the evil in Judea and Jerusalem, or Judah and Jerusalem, and the promised judgment that will come on Jerusalem as a result of it. And then also this looking forward to and this promise of a day when God will restore Jerusalem and make it what it was always intended to be in this new Jerusalem. And that language, by the way, if you are a student and pick it up, you'll find that language of the New Jerusalem in the last couple of chapters of the Bible and in the very end of Revelation. And so John the Revelator is using this language of New Jerusalem, and the vision that he's seeing in Revelation connects back to this promise from Isaiah. So that is in Isaiah a very important concept, this idea that there will be a new Jerusalem, that God will judge the Jerusalem that is, but then restore God's people and restore Jerusalem and make it what it ought to be in the New Jerusalem. And then in Isaiah chapter 6, we get the story of Isaiah's call and the moment or the experience that shows him or where God calls him to be a prophet. And this experience of this chapter is there's a lot here. He sees something really amazing. Isaiah is in the temple praying, and then suddenly he is seeing this vision of God seated on the throne. And so we're told that this is in the year that King Uzziah died. That's kind of how we can time the beginning or the early part of Isaiah's ministry. But it's in the year that King Uzziah died. It says, I saw the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne, and the train or the hem of his robe fills the temple. And above him are these angelic beings or these spiritual beings called the seraphim. And they are these mysterious beings. They're flying, and they're described as having 6 wings. And with 2 they cover their face, with 2 they cover their feet, and with the other 2 they fly. And so what is actually seen of these seraphim, these angelic beings, is wings and maybe a torso, but there's wings covering face, wings covering feet, and then 2 wings that are flying. And so they're very mysterious, not much is seen of them. And they are flying and calling out praises to God. Specifically, Isaiah records them saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. And so that's what these angelic figures are calling out. And what is a detail that is really remarkable and striking is that as these angelic beings are calling out and praising God, the temple itself is shaking. The doorposts and the thresholds of the temple are shaking violently, and smoke is filling up the whole temple. And the picture, the implication of these 2 images is, first we have God seated on this throne above the temple, above the whole world, and the whole temple is filled with the hem of his robe, being the very kind of bottom edge of God's robe. That very trailing edge of God's robe completely fills the temple. And so the temple is utterly inadequate to hold God. Just the trailing edge of his robe fills the whole thing up. And then, not just the voice of God, but the voice of these angelic messengers and angelic beings that serve God, the servants of God, their praise, their description of who God is so powerful that it almost shakes the temple apart and burns it down. The temple is filled with smoke, and the thresholds and doorposts are shaking. And, when you're in an earthquake, where do you go hide, or where do you go? You're told to go stand in a doorway, because that's structurally usually the strongest part of the building. And so the threshold and doorpost shaking is showing that even the strongest part of the building is affected by whatever's happening. And so the picture, the image, is that this building, the temple, which was built by Solomon to be the meeting place of God's presence and his people, where God's presence could dwell forever, and was supposed to be the kind of meeting place between heaven and earth. Even though it was built specifically for that purpose, it's totally inadequate to contain God's glory. Even the trailing edge of his robe consumes the whole temple, fills up the whole thing, and even the praises of the servants of God is almost more than the temple can bear, more than the temple can take without falling apart. And so God is exalted far above this temple, and his glory is greater far than anything the temple can contain. And then Isaiah sees this and recognizes God's greatness and holiness, And then his immediate reaction is this kind of despairing look at himself. He realizes upon seeing God's glory that he is not holy, that he is sinful. And so he cries out and says, "Woe is me, I am undone. I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the Lord Almighty." He's basically soul-crushed, realizing that he has seen God's glory as a sinful man, and the usual outcome of that is death. The usual outcome of that is destruction, that the person just dies from directly interacting with or seeing God's glory when they aren't prepared to be in God's presence. But one of these seraphim, these angelic figures, go over to the altar in the temple and take a hot coal from the altar and touch it to Isaiah's mouth. And then the angel, the seraphim, looks at him and says, "See this coal, this has touched your lips, and your guilt is taken away and your sin atoned for." And so Isaiah is not destroyed by God's presence, but his guilt is taken away and his sin atoned for. Now this picks up a theme that we saw in Hosea. If you remember with Hosea, there's the accusation from God that Israel has been committing spiritual adultery against God by their idolatry and their chasing after other gods and goddesses. And in the midst of that story, or in the midst of Hosea, we get this contrast, or this tension between God's holiness and justice, that God's nature requires that sin be punished and dealt with, that evil have consequences, and also God's compassion and love, that God wishes to forgive and extend mercy to those who trust him. And so there's this tension between these two things, and the way that tension works out in Hosea is that the people of Israel will go into captivity, they will be punished, there will be consequences for their action, but in the end, God's compassion and love will win out, and they will be restored and redeemed. And so we see that same theme being picked up here with Isaiah. Isaiah's sin is covered. He stands in the presence of God, which would normally be total destruction, but God provides a way for Isaiah to endure pain as a result of his sin and the sin of his people, as a hot coal is touched to his mouth, but not to finally and ultimately be destroyed. There is pain, but restoration. There's consequences, but not final destruction. And so that's Isaiah has the coal touched to his mouth and hears this promise or assurance of his forgiveness or his atonement from the angel. And then he hears God speak. He hears God's voice. And God says, "Whom shall I send and who will go for us?" Basically, who can I appoint? Who would volunteer to be my messenger, my prophet? And Isaiah, having just had all this experience, pipes up immediately and says, "Here am I, send me. I'll go." And God tells Isaiah to go and to tell this people, and then gives him the message that he is to speak. Tells him to go and speak to this people on God's behalf. And what's interesting in this message, or what God tells Isaiah to say, it's largely that you're going to go and give these messages. I'm going to send you to speak on my behalf, but nobody's going to listen to you. People are not going to hear you. They're not going to want to hear what you have to say. They're going to reject your messages, and it's going to keep them from turning and being healed. And so basically, the people of Judah have already gone too far. They're not going to hear what you say, but you're going to go and say it anyway. And Isaiah, being told basically he's being sent to do something that is going to have little effect, answers back and says, "For how long, God? For how long, O Lord? How long should I go and preach this fruitless message that nobody's going to listen to, and nobody's going to hear what I have to say? Nobody's going to respond to it. How long should I keep doing this?" And the answer that God gives is basically until there's no one left to hear it. Until the cities lie desolate and without inhabitant, until I have sent everyone far away, until the exile happens, until there's nobody left to hear what you have to say, you'll continue proclaiming these messages. Which is, bright and cheerful, right? It's exactly what you want to be told that you're going to do for the rest of your life. You're going to go and you're going to do something, and it's going to have no effect, and you're not allowed to stop doing it until everybody's gone. Have fun. So that's what Isaiah is told. That's his call as a prophet, is to go and proclaim God's message, even knowing ahead of time that it's not going to produce the results that he wants, that people are not going to respond to it in the ways that he thinks that they should, that God wants them to, but that he has to keep doing it. But at the very end of this, there is this last little chunk that is a promise of hope and restoration, that God is doing something beyond what Isaiah is going to be able to see. The last line in this is, but as the terebinth and the oak leave stumps when they are cut down, so the holy seed will be the stump in the land. And this may not seem like much, but the picture is of a tree that's been cut down and leaves a stump behind. Have any of you ever had to deal with cutting down a holly tree or a holly bush? We have, at some point in the past, my house had some landscaping that involved several holly trees, and they were later cut down. And every year we have to go out and cut back off the new growth that comes up from these holly stumps, because holly is incredibly tenacious. It doesn't want to die. And so if you leave a stump there with roots in the ground, you're going to be fighting it for years and years to keep it down because it wants to keep regrowing. And that's the picture that Isaiah is given for what God is going to do, that the people are going to be cut off and taken out of the land. They're going to be cut off like a tree, and then the tree taken down and carried off to be lumber. But as long as the stump remains, there is hope that something will regrow from that tree, that a tree will grow again in its place to replace it. And God says that there is a stump being left in the land, and that stump is the holy seed. And we're going to see this idea of the seed being picked up and used again and again and again through the rest of Isaiah, and then also again in the New Testament. And so the seed is this thing that is left behind, or that God is going to use to restore Israel. It's something that God can use to grow Israel from again. And so that's another major important concept. We got New Jerusalem and then the seed. And then we have a series, after Isaiah 6, we have a series of prophecies that deal with specific evil during the reign of some of the kings of Judah, especially Ahaz. If you remember our discussion the other day, Ahaz is the king that he's the first of the two kings in Judah that sacrifices his own son to the foreign idols. And then he also nails shut the doors of the temple to make sure that nobody can go in and worship. Right? So he's not a good king. He's bad news. And Isaiah is sent to deliver a message to Ahaz and tell him that basically his time is short, and that God is not going to allow him to continue given the evil that he's done and his unfaithfulness to God. And that prophecy, the thing that Isaiah does in that, if you remember when we were talking again about Hosea the other day, Hosea used the names of his children in order to illustrate what God was doing. God gave him names to give to his children in order to illustrate what God was about to do to Israel, how things were going to go for Israel. You remember the children that were named, the daughter that was named, I don't love you, and the son that was named, not mine. Remember those? By the way, I think I forgot to mention that there does end up being some good news for those kids. In the later part of the book, the prophecy, when the compassion and the hope comes in, God says that in the place where they were said not, where they were described as not loved, I will call them my beloved, and where of those who were said they are not my people or not mine, I will call them my people. They will be called people of the living God. And so it looks like the kids' names do get changed. It drops the negative from both of their names, and so not loved becomes my beloved, and not mine becomes my people. And so the names do get changed, thankfully for those kids. But Isaiah has a similar thing where God gives him a name to name a son, and that name is intended to be a picture of what God is about to do, a prophecy. And then this is when I describe it, this is going to also illustrate another kind of big principle when it comes to reading the prophets as a whole, that God often gives a message to a prophet that has a meaning for the people at the time, the people in the day when the prophet lives and breathes, that the people that originally hear it are going to understand, and it's going to affect them this way. But then also those same words, that same prophecy will have a much bigger or fuller meaning to a later generation, to people much further on. Something much bigger will be understood to have been meant by that original prophecy. And so it has a meaning both for the immediate audience and for somebody else or some other group later that will see it. God's people later will look back and be able to see that God was doing more than the original audience understood. And that's what's going to happen here. Isaiah is given a message to give to Ahaz, and he calls him out for all of his evil and the things that he's done. And then he promises that God is going to bring about his destruction and bring a new king to rule over God's people. And he names a son Emmanuel, and that you probably recognize that from around Christmas time, being used to refer to Jesus, because the name literally translates to God with us. God is with us. And so the name Emmanuel, Isaiah says that a virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and we will call him Emmanuel. And his intention with that prophecy is basically he's telling Ahaz and telling all those that support Ahaz that in the time it takes for a woman who is currently unmarried for a virgin to conceive and then give birth to a son, and then that child gets old enough to be weaned from his mother, in that time, Ahaz's kingdom will end, he'll be brought down, and God will send the new and better king to take his place. And that ends up being King Hezekiah, who is one of the better kings of Judah. And so, basically, this Emmanuel, the immediate reference, is to tell Ahaz and all those that support him that within 3 or 4 years, you're out. You're going to die, and another king will be on the throne. But then, of course, in the New Testament authors look at this and realize that Jesus fulfills this in a much more poignant, much more fuller way than the original audience understood, because Jesus is born to a literal virgin. Mary is the Virgin Mary, and she conceives and gives birth to a son, and that son is the Son of God, God with us. And so that it ends up being this much bigger fulfillment than even Isaiah and the people of his day would have understood at the time. And so we see that's a fairly frequent thing in the prophets, is that you'll see an immediate prophecy, a prophecy that has an immediate reference. God gives a message or a word to a particular people that has a particular meaning, but then looking back on it after seeing something else that God does later, you realize that God actually intended much more by it than originally understood. And so God has Isaiah speak of this Emmanuel that will, this child that will be born, named God with us, and that God will begin to restore his people through this. And so then we're also in this section shown that not only is this new Jerusalem that God is going to bring about, not only is it going to lead to the blessing and the prosperity of the people of Israel or of Judah, of the southern kingdom, but all nations will be blessed through this new Jerusalem, and all nations will come and seek God through this new city, the city of the New Jerusalem, and that it will be reigned over by this Messiah from the Davidic line, the anointed one, the anointed king from the line of David. And so this is the fulfillment then of the promises that God makes to Abraham way back in our first couple weeks of class, right? Where God promises to Abraham that through his family, all families on earth will be blessed. It will happen through this new Jerusalem and the Davidic king, the Messiah from David's line that will sit on the throne of this new Jerusalem. So that's the first 12 chapters and the major themes, and yes, we are 60% of the way through the hour and only 10% of the way through the book, or 20% of the way through the book. So we'll be speeding up now. In chapters 13 through 27, we get a series of promises of judgment for Babylon and for the surrounding nations surrounding Judah. And this section is kind of significant, is important, because it connects to things that you're going to see in a lot of the other prophets of this period. There's a major concern among some of the prophets that God is going to use Babylon. They see it coming. God is going to use Babylon to judge God's people, But then they look at Babylon and they see that Babylon is even worse than Judah, that Babylon does things even worse than the people of Judah do. And so why is God, good, just, righteous, holy God, going to use this evil people to accomplish his will? And so we'll see that God, in this promise of judgment on Babylon and the other surrounding nations and things that we'll see in the other prophets, we see that God does not condone the actions of Babylon or these other nations, these other kingdoms. God just uses them to bring his judgment. But God using them to bring judgment does not mean that God agrees with them, condones them, approves of them, and God does not leave their actions unpunished. We'll also see a theme throughout several of the prophets, including Isaiah here, that God uses one violent nation to judge the evils of the previous violent nation. And so we see that God uses the Assyrians to judge several different nations, including the northern kingdom Israel. But then God is going to use the Babylonians to judge the Assyrians and wipe them out. And then the Babylonians, being just as unjust and cruel as those that came before him, God will use another empire, the Persians, to judge the Babylonians. And then God will use yet another empire to judge the Persians. It's the Greeks this time. And so on, until this string of violent nations, violent empires is done. God will use one to judge the next, or one to judge the last, and all of them, none of them will get away with their evil and their injustice. And so God promises judgment on Babylon and all of these surrounding nations that have done evil things, done harm to Judah. Even though they're being used, God is using their evil and their injustice in order to judge Judah. They don't get away with it. They don't get away with doing evil just because God is using that evil to accomplish his good plan. And then there is a return to this, again, the concept of the New Jerusalem. And again, it's a contrast between the people of the Jerusalem that is, and specifically the leaders of the Jerusalem that is, and the Jerusalem that should be. And Jerusalem, in this case, as it is described as this lofty city, or this city full of pride and arrogance. And that because of their pride and arrogance, they are going to fall, that God is going to bring judgment on them. But that, again, there is to be a new Jerusalem where God will restore and bring his people home, restore them, and make Jerusalem what it was always supposed to be. And then chapters 28 through 39, verse 28 through 35, there's several descriptions of the evils of the leaders of Judah, the things that they do wrong, the evil that they've done, and promising judgment on them for the various evils that they do. And then amongst those, the evils that are described is that they keep turning to these other nations. They keep depending on these foreign nations for their protection rather than depending on God. And so they make a treaty with Egypt, and they depend on Egypt to protect them from the Assyrians rather than asking God to defend them and protect them from the Assyrians. And so they keep making these treaties and these agreements, and they keep paying large sums of money to Egypt and other nations in order to shore up their defenses and to try to protect themselves rather than trusting God for protection. And there's, this is betrayal, or this is being unfaithful, and the end result is going to be that these nations that they depend on will fail them. And then, starting in chapter 36, we see this fulfilled. We see this promise, or this dependence on these other nations is going to fail them. In chapter 36 and 37, we have the description of the Assyrian siege of Jerusalem. Assyria, we talked about this the other day, that during Hezekiah's reign, Assyria comes in and attacks the southern kingdom. They capture a few towns in kind of the northern part of Judah, and then they besiege the capital city, Jerusalem. And the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, sends messengers ahead to taunt the people of Jerusalem, to tell them not to trust their king Hezekiah, that if they will surrender, then they'll be given all of these benefits and all of this wealth and riches before they're taken off into their new homeland in the Assyrian Empire. But if they resist, they'll all be killed off. And notice how all of these previous kingdoms and all these previous nations have tried to resist and have failed. Their kings couldn't save them, their gods couldn't save them, so yours can't save you either. Basically, don't trust Hezekiah when he says that he's coming, because nobody else has been able to, that he can defend you when we come, because nobody else has been able to defend their people he can't either. And Hezekiah is worried about this, but consults Isaiah, and Isaiah says God will get rid of the Assyrians, and this messenger that has made this ruckus around you, he'll be killed in his next battle anyway, so don't worry about him. And sure enough, something comes up, and the Assyrian army has to go and defend something elsewhere, that they have to go and deal with a military problem somewhere else, and that loudmouth cursing messenger dies in that battle. But then the king of Assyria, Sennacherib, comes right back and puts Jerusalem back under siege again. But this time, having seen God deliver him once, Hezekiah has more boldness, and so he goes into the temple and loudly, publicly proclaims and begs for God's deliverance from this army. And so when he puts his trust in God, God delivers him and delivers Jerusalem, and overnight, well over 100,000, plus I think it's 180,000, the text says, soldiers just die. 180,000 Assyrian soldiers die overnight. And when Sennacherib the king wakes up the next morning and sees that, the camp is largely full of bodies, that most of his army is dead, he packs everybody else up and heads home, and they don't even take the time to bury the bodies. They just leave. And when he gets back to Assyria, two of his sons assassinate him while he is in the temple, his own private shrine or private temple to his god. And so they assassinate him inside of his own temple and flee, and another one of his sons becomes king of Assyria. And that begins the fall of the Assyrian Empire. They start falling apart after that. The succession crisis after that messes up the nation, and then Babylon is able to rebel and take over. And so we see Hezekiah demonstrating faith, and that leading to God rescuing the people from the Assyrians. But then in the very next chapter, that's 36 and 37, in 38, and then in 39, we see Hezekiah failing again. And in this series, these two chapters, Hezekiah first is impudent or arrogant, and so God allows him to be struck with a disease, and then he humbles himself, and so God says that he will not die. God will add 15 years to his life. And then immediately after that, Hezekiah hosts an envoy from Babylon, this new upstart kingdom that has thrown off their Assyrian captors or oppressors, and will eventually take over, defeat the capital city of Nineveh, and become the new empire. But this new group of folks, the Babylonians, he receives an envoy and shows them all of the riches of his kingdom. And the implication in Isaiah, with the way that the stories are told in Isaiah, is that he is showing them all of these treasures in order to impress them with his wealth and demonstrate that he would be a worthy ally. And so he's trying to make a new treaty with another power in order to shore up Israel's protection or Judah's protection. And so he's doing what the previous kings had done in trusting Egypt. And Isaiah comes back and tells Hezekiah that because he has done this and shown off all these treasures and done this thing, instead of depending on God, he is, at some point in the future, Babylon will be back. They will betray the nation and take off all of those treasures that he has shown and take the people off into captivity as well. And so Isaiah tells Hezekiah that Babylon is coming back because of what you've done. And that foreshadows the end of Judah. Isaiah, as far as we know, was unlikely to have lived until the actual collapse of Judah. Was still few decades in the future at the time that he says this to Hezekiah, and so he's probably old enough by this point that he wasn't going to live until the actual fall. But this event serves as kind of a break in the prophecies in Isaiah. And up until this point, as I mentioned, we have all of these descriptions of the evil done by Judah and the surrounding nations and all of the judgment that God is going to pour out on them. And then we have this story foreshadowing the defeat of Judah by Babylon and the beginning of the exile. And then after that, we have this series of prophecies. The last 27 chapters seem to be focused on giving comfort to God's people that are already in exile, or that have been exiled and are able to return home now. And so there's a couple of things that have been theorized that are what may be happening here. One is that we have actually separate authors for the two halves, or the two sections of Isaiah. That we have chapters 1 through 39 is actually Isaiah, and then chapters 40 through 66 are somebody later coming back and writing in Isaiah's voice, or writing in the name of Isaiah. Another possibility is that Isaiah is just shown visions of what's going to happen in the future, and he records them, and that's what we have in the latter half is him writing God's message to these future people, even though he didn't live to see that situation. There's this interesting note, or interesting comments throughout some of this early section, though. There are 2 or 3, maybe 4 occasions where Isaiah says that he has been told to seal up a message in a scroll, and he gives it to someone to keep, to maintain. And so he gives it to a follower of his, somebody that is helping him, serving him, learning from him, and gives it to them to maintain and to keep that scroll. And so he takes these scrolls and he seals them up with wax so that nobody can open them without breaking the wax seal and it being obvious that the scroll has been opened. And so he's sealing them up to be opened at a later date. And so what may very well have happened is either Isaiah writes these scrolls, writes these prophecies, he's shown something for the future, and so he seals it up in a scroll and then gives it to an attendant or to one of his disciples to be opened in the future. And then either that scroll is opened, or some of those scrolls are open, and that's what we have for these last 27 chapters, that Isaiah seals up these messages in a scroll and then they're later opened, and that's what we got. Or he seals up these messages in these scrolls, they're later opened by his disciples, and then the material that they find there is added to or adapted or pulled together to be this last half. And so it's still based on, or is largely the message from Isaiah, but may have been adapted and adjusted by his future disciples during the time that they are reading it, the time that they're looking at it, reading it, and applying it to the situation they find themselves in at the day. Either way, whichever one you think actually is the way it went, this latter portion is full of a lot more messages of hope and comfort than the previous section was, because it's intended for future people that have already experienced this exile. They are either in exile or have just gotten to return from exile, and they're being given a lot of reassurance and comfort that God is going to restore his people and bless them, and again, that the future New Jerusalem is coming, that God is going to do it. And in the midst of all this comfort and promises of restoration, we're introduced to this very important figure in Isaiah called the servant. And there's several of the poems or prophecies in this section that are called the servant songs of Isaiah. They start in chapter 42 is the first, and then they kind of jump every few chapters. There's 42, and then there's 49, and then the best known is chapters 52 and 53 of Isaiah. But this servant is introduced as being this person that will come and do God's will and deliver God's messages, be as a prophet, and then also is described as being like the seed. This holy seed will be this prophet, or this servant of God, and then also this messenger, or this anointed one from the line of David. And so the servant is hinted at that it will be a future descendant of David, potentially the Messiah, certainly the seed that is mentioned earlier in Isaiah, and that he will be the one that does God's will, and it will be through the servant that God will bring about this restoration and the new city, the New Jerusalem. And so all that sounds pretty good. We get the idea that the servant is going to be a king, but he's not going to be a king like lots of other kings. In fact, he's described as a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wick he will not stuff out. And so it's a king that rejects the normal system or the normal ways of having or holding power. Instead of using violence to achieve his goals, he instead shows compassion, and even things that are apparently useless he won't destroy just for the sake of getting them out of the way or destroying them. A smoldering wick will not stuff out, a bruised reed he will not break. It's that, getting some kind of unexpected images of what this king will be like, but still a picture of a king. And that, when we come to Isaiah 52 and 53, the best known servant songs, we get an even more jarring image of what this servant will be. Again, we've been kind of hinted at that this will be a king, that this will be the king in the royal line of David, the seed, And so we expect him to come as a king, and yet what we find in chapters 52 and 53 is not a kingly figure, but a sufferer. In fact, because of this chapter, sometimes the servant of Isaiah is called the suffering servant of Isaiah. And there's several sections of it, but probably the best known, the one that you will recognize as I read it to you, is from chapter 53, verses 4 and following. It says, "Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray, each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." And then there's further language in this section that seems to talk about the servant seeing his coming to death, suffering to the point of dying, being killed, and then also about having his days extended and seeing the light of life and being able to see the product of his labor, of his sufferings. And so there seems to be this image of this suffering servant identified with this kingly servant that has been talked about in other messages, the other prophecy of Isaiah up to this point. This suffering servant who will die and then live. And so you can see with this description how the New Testament authors start to look back at Isaiah and this section specifically to talk about Jesus, and they see Jesus fulfilling this servant king who will die for the sins of his people and then live again and get to see the fulfillment of his labor, and will ultimately bring about this new Jerusalem again. See the very end of Revelation. And so the suffering servant, or the servant of Isaiah, is a very important figure, very important theme through especially this latter portion of Isaiah. And then there's also a reference to the servants who will follow this servant, the ones who will come in the line of this great servant and follow this great servant. And though they will suffer and be harmed along with him, as they serve him, they will bring about the restoration of the kingdom and the new Jerusalem, and finally enjoy the new creation. And so there's this kind of final hope brought about through this suffering servant. There's also, just as a kind of a final trivia, interesting note, if you look in Isaiah 45, there is a message given very specifically for King Cyrus, and given instructions to King Cyrus to release the people to go back to Jerusalem, to be able to rebuild the city, and to rebuild and rededicate the temple so that offerings can be made to God on his behalf. And what's interesting about this very specific message for King Cyrus is that King Cyrus was the emperor of the Persian Empire, which would replace the Babylonian Empire, and we still have the Assyrian Empire on the scene when Isaiah was alive. And so King Cyrus would not be born for over 150 years after Isaiah died. And yet Isaiah is given a very specific message for King Cyrus. That's unusual for the prophets. They don't usually get that specific of a message for the future, but Isaiah seems to. That's it. We're out of time, and we'll be back for another of the prophets on Friday.